The Galactic Defense Coalition had achieved something that most civilizations could only dream of. Perfect bureaucratic paralysis. After 3,000 years of interspecies cooperation, they had refined the art of committee formation to such exquisite levels that they could now create 17 subcommittees just to decide what color the meeting room walls should be. Naturally, when faced with an actual crisis, their first instinct was to form another committee. The crisis in question was approaching from the outer rim territories at precisely 0.7 light speed, which was fast enough to be alarming, but slow enough for the coalition's finest minds to spend several days arguing about appropriate response protocols. The enemy fleet, because naturally, it was always an enemy fleet, consisted of roughly 200 vessels of unknown configuration, heading straight for the Kepler trade junction. This was problematic for several reasons, not least of which was that the junction handled approximately 60% of all galactic commerce, and losing it would make the Coalition Council's quarterly economic reports look rather embarrassing. The Coalition's response had been, predictably, to convene the Emergency Strategic Response Committee, which then created the Tactical Assessment Subcommittee, which promptly established the Crisis Management Working Group. Each group spent considerable time drafting proposals that the others would inevitably reject for failing to follow proper formatting guidelines. Meanwhile, the approaching fleet continued approaching, displaying the kind of single-minded determination that suggested they weren't particularly interested in participating in a bureaucratic process. Admiral Vexthani of the Crystalline Hierarchy, current rotating chair of the Emergency Strategic Response Committee, possessed 4 arms, 3 independently functioning brains, and absolutely zero patience for the current situation. She had spent the last 72 hours listening to her colleagues debate the finer points of engagement protocols, while watching the enemy close distance with mathematical precision. Perhaps, she suggested during what was officially the 14th emergency session, but felt like the 47th, we should consider actually fighting them. The suggestion caused a ripple of concerned murmurs around the holographic conference table. General Corthen, whose species had evolved from a particularly anxious form of herd animal, began nervously grooming his neck fur. But Admiral, we haven't completed the threat assessment matrix. How can we engage without proper risk evaluation metrics? Commander Zelpak, representing the Logical Synthesis Union, consulted the data display grafted directly into his forehead. Current projections indicate a 73.6% probability that conventional engagement strategies will prove inadequate. The enemy formation patterns suggest familiarity with standard coalition tactics. This was, of course, the crux of their problem. The coalition had spent millennia perfecting their approach to warfare, creating detailed manuals, establishing clear chains of command, and developing strategies so thoroughly documented that enemy forces had apparently been using them as study guides. It was at this moment of collective realization that someone history would never record who, though several species would later claim credit, made the suggestion that would either save the galaxy or provide future historians with an excellent example of spectacular institutional failure. What about the humans? The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either brilliant innovations or catastrophic disasters. In this case, it would prove to be both. The human contingent within the coalition was relatively small, consisting of roughly 3,000 individuals scattered across various positions throughout the fleet. They had joined the galactic community approximately 50 years earlier, after finally developing faster-than-light travel and discovering that the galaxy was already occupied by beings who had been perfecting bureaucracy longer than humans had been using written language. What made humans unique, according to the xenopsychology reports, was their tendency to approach problems from completely unexpected angles, where most species would carefully analyze a situation using established frameworks. Humans had an alarming habit of improvising solutions that either worked brilliantly or failed spectacularly, sometimes both simultaneously. The human tactical officers have shown interesting results in simulation exercises, Admiral Vexthani admitted, consulting her personal files. Their success rate is approximately equal to standard approaches, but their methods are statistically impossible to predict. Unpredictability could be advantageous, observed Commander Zelpak, though his tone suggested he found the concept personally offensive. If we cannot anticipate human tactical decisions, perhaps the enemy cannot either. General Corthen stopped grooming his fur long enough to raise an objection, but giving a human command authority would require bypassing approximately 47 levels of standard protocol verification. The paperwork alone would take weeks. "We have approximately 18 hours before the enemy reaches the junction," the admiral reminded them. This led to another period of silence, during which the assembled beings contemplated the unprecedented step of actually making a decision quickly. The human they selected was a mid-level tactical officer currently stationed aboard the Coalition flagship. The selection process involved sophisticated algorithms, detailed psychological profiles, and the kind of careful analysis that the Coalition applied to every decision of minor importance. Unfortunately, they had forgotten to run the selection algorithm twice to check for errors, which meant they had inadvertently chosen someone who had only received the position through a clerical mistake involving two officers with similar service numbers. The universe, as it often did, was about to demonstrate its sense of humor. The human officer who found himself suddenly elevated to temporary fleet command had been enjoying a perfectly reasonable breakfast of synthetic protein paste and recycled coffee when the summons arrived. He had been contemplating the philosophical implications of artificial bacon flavor when his personal communicator began emitting the specific sequence of tones that indicated either imminent promotion or court-martial proceeding. Given his recent luck with filing reports in triplicate, he had been expecting the latter. The briefing room aboard the Coalition flagship was designed to accommodate 17 different species, which meant it looked like the result of a collaboration between an architect, a xenobiologist, and someone with a severe psychological disorder. The ceiling curved at angles that defied Euclidean geometry to provide proper sightlines for beings with compound eyes, while the floor featured specialized seating designed for everything from humanoid bipeds to the aquatic collectives represented, who required a mobile tank of pressurized methane. The human took his place at what appeared to be the designated chair for carbon-based life forms of average height and surveyed his new command staff. They in turn surveyed him with expressions that ranged from cautious optimism to barely concealed horror. Admiral Vexthani activated the central holographic display, which immediately began projecting a three-dimensional representation of the approaching enemy fleet. The formation was, as predicted, textbook perfect. Each vessel maintained precise spacing, moved in coordinated patterns, and demonstrated the kind of tactical discipline that military academies used in instructional video. The enemy force consists of 237 vessels arranged in standard deep space engagement formation pattern 7, reported Commander Zelpak, his forehead display flickering with updated intelligence data. Their approach vector suggests familiarity with Coalition defensive protocols. The human studied the display for approximately 30 seconds, which caused several of his new subordinates to shift uncomfortably. Most species required considerably longer to process tactical information, preferring to run multiple analytical algorithms before reaching preliminary conclusions. "They're using the manual," he observed. General Corthen paused mid-groom to stare at him. Manual. Standard Galactic Fleet Tactics, 3rd edition. Chapter 12. Subsection 4. Optimal Formation Strategies for Multi-Vector Assault Operations. "They're following it exactly." The human gestured at the holographic display. "Look at the spacing between their heavy cruisers. That's the precise distance recommended for maximum overlapping fire coverage while minimizing friendly fire incidents." This observation caused what could charitably be described as thoughtful silence, or more accurately, the sound of multiple civilizations' military doctrines experiencing simultaneous existential crises. "But," stammered General Corthen, "that manual represents 3 millennia of accumulated tactical wisdom. It has been tested and refined across thousands of engagements." "Right," agreed the human, "which is why everyone knows exactly what to expect when someone uses it." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle humming of life support systems and what sounded suspiciously like Commander Zelpak running stress diagnostics on his implanted processors. Admiral Vexthani cleared what passed for her throat among her species. "Are you suggesting that our tactical doctrines are predictable?" "I'm suggesting that when you publish your battle plans and distribute them throughout the galaxy, your enemies tend to read them." The human pulled up his own data interface, highlighting specific sections of the enemy formation. "See how their screening destroyers are positioned? That's optimal placement for countering Coalition formation pattern 12. And their reserve units are staged precisely where they'd need to be to exploit the weakness in our standard defensive grid." The implications of this revelation settled over the command staff like a slowly spreading stain. 3,000 years of military evolution had apparently created the most well-documented and thoroughly analyzed tactical system in galactic history, which meant that any enemy with access to a library could predict exactly how coalition forces would respond to any given situation. So the human continued, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was casually demolishing several species' fundamental understanding of warfare. The question becomes, do you want strategy or chaos? It was a question that would later be studied by military historians, philosophers and xenopsychologists across dozens of species. At the time, however, it simply caused Admiral Vexthani's forearms to begin twitching in what her species did instead of having nervous breakdown. Strategy, she managed. Obviously we want strategy. The human nodded as though this had been precisely the answer he expected. Good choice. Chaos is messier, and I haven't had enough coffee for proper chaos today. What followed was a planning session that would have given traditional military theorists the kind of nightmares typically reserved for tax auditors and philosophy majors. The human began by pulling up historical databases, but instead of accessing coalition military records, he started browsing through something called human military history. Right, he said, highlighting what appeared to be primitive warfare conducted with chemical propellants and metal projectiles. So there was this battle called Cannae, where a smaller force completely destroyed a much larger army by doing something everyone knew was tactically impossible. Commander Zelpak's forehead display began flickering at an alarming rate, but the tactical mathematics indicate that such an approach would result in catastrophic casualties. It did, the human agreed cheerfully. For the others, the explanation that followed involved concepts that most of the assembled officers found philosophically disturbing. The human described tactics based on deliberate deception, strategies that relied on appearing weak to encourage enemy overconfidence, and maneuvers designed to exploit psychological rather than tactical weaknesses. But this completely disregards established principles of force concentration and strategic positioning, protested General Corthan. That's the point, replied the human. If you disregard the principles, your enemy can't predict your moves by consulting the manual. By the time the planning session concluded, the coalition command staff had experienced something between enlightenment and severe psychological trauma. They had agreed to implement tactics that violated everything they understood about proper military procedure, based on the recommendations of someone who had apparently learned warfare from a species that still considered chemical explosives and metal projectiles to be acceptable military technology. The enemy fleet meanwhile continued its approach, completely unaware that they were about to encounter something that shouldn't exist, an opponent who had never read the manual. Admiral Vexthani looked at the battle plans displayed before her, and wondered if this was how evolution felt when it accidentally created intelligence. Terrifying, exhilarating, and probably going to end badly. 15 hours until engagement, she announced. All units, prepare. Whatever this is going to be, the coalition fleet that emerged from hyperspace to defend the Kepler trade junction bore absolutely no resemblance to any formation pattern ever documented in galactic military history. To an outside observer, it might have appeared that the fleet commander had suffered a complete psychological breakdown, scattered his vessels seemingly at random, and then decided to take a nap. The enemy fleet, observing this apparent chaos through their long-range sensors, experienced something that military analysts would later classify as tactical confusion syndrome. Their formation, still maintaining textbook perfection, began running probability calculations that kept returning results indicating a 98.7% chance that the coalition forces had malfunctioned. Sir, reported the enemy tactical officer, whose species had evolved from particularly methodical predators, the coalition fleet appears to be, well, there's no tactical term for what they appear to be doing. The enemy commander, a veteran of 43 successful campaigns fought according to proper strategic principles, studied the sensor readings with growing bewilderment. Are they retreating? No, some of their vessels are advancing, others are holding position, and their heavy cruisers appear to be hiding behind the asteroid field. Hiding? There's no other word for it, sir. They've positioned themselves in sensor shadows where our targeting systems can't achieve proper lock. The enemy commander consulted his tactical manual, searching for appropriate responses to opponents who hid behind rocks like primitive guerrilla fighters. The manual, unfortunately, had been written by beings who assumed their enemies would follow established conventions of civilized warfare. Aboard the coalition flagship, the human commander was experiencing what could charitably be described as professional satisfaction, or more accurately, the kind of vindictive joy that comes from watching perfectly organized systems collapse into beautiful chaos. Enemy fleet is maintaining standard formation, reported Commander Zelpak,
though his tone suggested he was beginning to question the very nature of reality. "They're advancing according to established tactical doctrine." "Of course they are," replied the human, monitoring multiple data streams simultaneously. "They're professionals. They're going to do exactly what they've been trained to do, which is exactly what we want them to do." Admiral Vexthani, who had spent the last several hours oscillating between fascination and terror, watched the tactical display with morbid curiosity. "And what exactly do we want them to do?" "Win," said the human cheerfully. This statement caused General Cawthon to pause in the middle of stress grooming his neck fur. "We want them to win. We want them to think they're winning. There's a difference." The first phase of the engagement began when the enemy fleet encountered the Coalition's advanced screening force, consisting of exactly 12 destroyers positioned in what appeared to be a suicidal forward deployment. The enemy commander, following proper tactical doctrine, concentrated his fire on these isolated vessels, destroying them with minimal casualties. "Enemy has eliminated our forward screen," reported the tactical officer aboard the Coalition flagship. "Excellent," replied the human. "Right on schedule." The enemy fleet, emboldened by their initial success, pressed forward into what their sensors indicated was a poorly defended gap in the Coalition's formation. Their lead elements advanced confidently, maintaining proper spacing and following established attack vectors. They were approximately halfway through the gap when the human gave his next order. "All units, execute maneuver." "Well, we never actually named it. Let's call it aggressive redeployment." What happened next would later require military academies to invent new terms for tactical impossibility. Coalition vessels that had appeared to be retreating suddenly reversed course and began accelerating toward the enemy fleet from unexpected vectors. Ships that had been hiding in asteroid shadows emerged to deliver devastating flanking attacks. Reserve units that shouldn't have existed materialized from sensor mast positions behind debris field. The enemy fleet, caught in the middle of what they had assumed was a successful advance, suddenly found themselves surrounded by opponents attacking from directions that violated several basic principles of three-dimensional warfare. "Sir," reported the enemy tactical officer, his voice carrying the tone of someone watching his entire understanding of reality collapse, "we're being attacked by vessels that our sensors indicate aren't there." The enemy commander studied his displays, noting that Coalition forces were apparently occupying positions that his tactical computers insisted were mathematically impossible. "How many ships are we facing?" "Unknown, sir. Our count keeps changing. They appear to be using some form of tactical multiplexing." This was in fact precisely what they were doing. The human had positioned his forces so that individual vessels could engage the enemy, withdraw into sensor shadows, reposition, and emerge to attack again from different locations. To enemy sensors, it appeared as though they were facing twice as many opponents as actually existed. "Enemy formation is beginning to collapse," observed Commander Zelpak, his forehead display flickering with data streams that his processors were struggling to categorize. "They're trying to reform into defensive positions," added Admiral Vexthani, watching the enemy fleet attempt to establish proper tactical formations while under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. "Let them," said the human. "Defensive formations are even more predictable than offensive ones." The second phase of the battle began when the enemy commander, demonstrating the kind of tactical flexibility that had made his species successful military leaders, ordered his fleet to adopt formation pattern 15, enhanced defensive matrix with overlapping fire zone. It was, according to every military manual in the galaxy, the correct response to a multi-vector attack. It was also exactly what the human had been waiting for. "All units, implement the thing we discussed," he announced over the tactical network. "The thing?" questioned General Koth. "The historically impossible thing that shouldn't work but probably will because nobody expects it." What followed was a maneuver that combined elements of ancient human naval tactics, three-dimensional spatial geometry, and what appeared to be deliberate violation of basic physics. Coalition forces converged on the enemy defensive formation from angles that should have left them exposed to concentrated fire, using approach vectors that placed them in positions where they shouldn't have been able to maintain formation coherence. The enemy fleet, attempting to respond according to established defensive protocols, found themselves firing at targets that kept appearing in locations where targets weren't supposed to be able to appear. "Sir," reported the enemy tactical officer, "our defensive fire is missing targets that our computers confirm we should be hitting. Are our targeting systems malfunctioning?" "No, sir. The targets are exactly where our sensors say they are. They're just not where they're supposed to be." The final phase of the engagement was over before the enemy commander fully understood what had happened. His perfectly organized fleet, following textbook tactical procedures, had been systematically dismantled by opponents who appeared to be making up their strategy as they went along. In the aftermath, as coalition forces secured the surviving enemy vessels, the human commander surveyed the tactical displays with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Well," he announced to his stunned command staff, "that went approximately as expected." Admiral Vexthani stared at the battle results, trying to process the fact that they had achieved total victory while suffering casualties that barely registered as statistical noise. "How did you know it would work?" The human shrugged. "I didn't, but I knew their response would be predictable, which meant we could plan for it. But what if they had responded differently? Then we would have adapted. That's what you do when you're not following a manual." The silence that followed was the sound of several species' military establishments having simultaneous philosophical breakdown. The post-battle analysis session convened exactly 47 minutes after the last enemy vessel had surrendered, which represented a new coalition record for bureaucratic efficiency. This was primarily because nobody could figure out what forms to fill out for a victory that had been achieved through methods that didn't technically exist. Admiral Vexthani sat at the head of the conference table, staring at tactical reports that read like fiction written by someone with a severe psychological disorder. The enemy fleet had been neutralized with a casualty ratio of approximately 1 coalition vessel damaged for every 37 enemy ships destroyed or disabled. These were the kind of numbers that usually indicated either gross exaggeration or clerical errors. "Let me understand this correctly," she began, addressing the human commander who was currently enjoying what appeared to be his 4th cup of coffee. "You defeated a numerically superior force by hiding behind rocks." "Among other things," the human replied, apparently finding nothing unusual about having just revolutionized galactic warfare over breakfast. "The rocks were just tactical terrain utilization. The real advantage was that they kept trying to fight the battle they had prepared for, instead of the battle they were actually in." Commander Zelpak's forehead display had been flickering continuously for the past hour as his processors attempted to categorize tactical data that defied conventional analysis. "But your maneuvers violated established principles of formation coherency, fire concentration, and spatial positioning optimization. That's why they worked," the human explained with the patient tone of someone addressing particularly slow students. "If you do what everyone expects, you get predictable results. If you do something nobody expects, you get unpredictable results. Generally speaking, unpredictable results. Generally speaking, unpredictable results favor whoever is being unpredictable." General Corthan had progressed from stress grooming to what appeared to be stress molting, leaving small patches of fur scattered around his workstation. "But how do you plan for unpredictable results? How do you create tactical doctrine based on unpredictability?" "You don't," replied the human. "That's the point." The implications of this statement settled over the assembled officers, like the slowly dawning realization that everything they thought they knew about military strategy had been fundamentally wrong for approximately 3,000 years. "Are you suggesting," Admiral Vexthani asked carefully, "that our entire approach to warfare has been counterproductive?" The human considered this question while consuming more synthetic caffeine. "Not counterproductive, exactly. More like overly productive. You've become so good at standardized warfare that everyone knows exactly what to expect from you. It's like playing a game where you announce your moves in advance." The silence that followed was broken by the gentle sound of Commander Zelpak's processors finally giving up and initiating emergency shutdown protocols. Within 6 hours of the battle's conclusion, word had begun spreading through coalition command structures with the kind of velocity typically associated with infectious diseases or celebrity scandal. Fleet commanders across 17 sectors were demanding copies of the tactical analysis, while military academies were frantically revising curriculum plans that had remained unchanged for centuries. The coalition high command, displaying the kind of bureaucratic agility that had made them legendary, immediately convened the Emergency Strategic Review Committee to assess the implications of what was being called either the greatest tactical innovation in galactic history, or a dangerous precedent that threatened the fundamental order of civilized warfare. "We need to understand what happened," declared Fleet Admiral Corinthe during the emergency session. "If human tactical approaches are genuinely superior, we must integrate them into standard coalition doctrine. And if they're not superior," added General Vexcoroni, "we need to ensure that other species don't attempt to replicate methods that could prove catastrophically unpredictable." The human commander, when summoned to explain his methods to the High Command, found himself facing a tribunal of the galaxy's most distinguished military minds, all of whom appeared to be experiencing various stages of existential crisis. "Officer," began Fleet Admiral Corinthe, "we need you to explain your tactical methodology so that it can be properly analyzed and incorporated into Coalition strategic doctrine." The human looked around the assembled tribunal, noting expressions that ranged from desperate hope to barely concealed panic. "With respect, Admiral, that's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. Explain. If you turn what happened into doctrine, it stops being unpredictable. If it stops being unpredictable, it stops working. You'd just be creating a new manual for your enemies to read." The silence that followed was the sound of an entire military establishment, realizing that they had accidentally discovered something that couldn't be systematized, codified, or properly bureaucratized. "Then how," asked General Vex Coroni, "do we replicate these results?" "You don't replicate them," the human replied. "You do something completely different next time. But how do we know what to do if we can't plan for it? You improvise." The word improvise hit the assembled officers with roughly the same impact as a small asteroid. Most galactic species had spent millennia eliminating improvisation from their military structures, replacing it with carefully planned procedures and extensively tested protocols. "Improvise," repeated Fleet Admiral Corinthe, as though testing the word for structural integrity. "You assess the situation, consider your options, and make the best decision you can with the information available. Then you adapt when circumstances change. But what if we make the wrong decision?" The human shrugged. "Then you make a different decision. The enemy will probably make wrong decisions too, especially if they're following a manual." As the implications of this conversation spread through Coalition command structures, a curious thing began to happen. Military officers, who had spent their entire careers following established procedures, started quietly experimenting with minor tactical variations. Academy instructors began introducing hypothetical scenarios that couldn't be resolved through standard doctrine. Fleet commanders started reviewing historical battles, looking for examples of successful improvisation.
The enemy fleet that had been defeated at Kepler Junction, after being processed through Coalition intelligence systems, revealed something that would have profound implications for galactic warfare. Their tactical computers contained complete copies of Coalition strategic doctrine going back 2 millennia, along with detailed analysis of standard response patterns and optimal countermeasures. In other words, they had been planning to fight a war against an enemy whose every move they could predict with mathematical precision. Instead, they had encountered someone who hadn't read the manual. 3 months later, when the human commander was quietly transferred to a new position that didn't officially exist, Admiral Vextani found herself reviewing the final battle reports. The engagement at Kepler Junction had been reclassified 17 times as various departments attempted to categorize something that didn't fit existing frameworks. She activated her personal communicator and contacted the human, who was apparently somewhere in the Outer Rim territories doing something that intelligence reports described as creatively unconventional diplomatic work. "I have a question," she told him. "Go ahead. When we asked you if you wanted strategy or chaos, you chose strategy. But what you gave us looked suspiciously like chaos." There was a pause during which she could hear what sounded like distant explosions and someone shouting instructions in an unfamiliar language. "Admiral," the human replied, "when you've spent your entire career preparing for strategy, chaos looks like better strategy. And if we had chosen chaos, then you would have gotten actual chaos. Trust me, you made the right choice." As Admiral Vextani ended the communication, she reflected on the fact that the galaxy had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of predictable warfare, only to discover that the most effective strategy was to have no strategy at all. The universe, she decided, had a sense of humor that bordered on the malicious. Somewhere in the Outer Rim, a human was probably improvising solutions to problems that shouldn't have solutions, armed with nothing more than caffeine and a fundamental inability to follow proper procedure. And somehow this was working better than anything the galaxy had tried in millennia.